You always hear about the Midas touch. In other words, when Midas touched things, everything would turn to gold. Before he was given that gift, Midas was a very good and very pious king. And he had gained favor, and it's funny too, he had gained favor from the god Dionysus, who granted him a wish. And the reason the god Dionysus granted him a wish was that, again, Midas at one day had been down at the sea. And he rescued this person that was in the waves, and it turned out to be one of Dionysus's friends. I'm not sure exactly who the person was, but Midas risked his own life and pulled this person out of the sea, and Dionysus all of a sudden magically appeared out of nowhere and said, that was a really incredible sacrificial thing you did, and we need to think about that, because that's one thing, too, about Taurus. They will sacrifice for their loved ones, without thinking about themselves. They'll go first, and then later, after they get through the tragedy or the crisis, they'll realize they could have been hurt or killed, but they don't think about it in the moment because they're really there with their heart. And so he pulls this person out of the sea, and Dionysus gives him one wish. Whatever you want, you can have. So Midas, without thinking and only going with his senses and his desires, wishes that anything he touches will turn to gold. Well, this greedy wish basically destroyed him, because when he got on his horse, the horse turned to gold. When he got back to the castle, he tried to eat his food. It turned to gold. But the worst thing of all, was when he went to embrace his little girl, he held her and she turned to gold. At which point, he ran back to the sea and he asked Dionysus to reverse the wish. So in other words, he wasn't thinking before he responded to his senses. And this is one of the things we sometimes again see in the sign of Taurus. Taurus always comes late April, May. May is named after the goddess Maya, who was the mother of Hermes or Mercury, or the communicator, who comes in June in Gemini. And that's always interesting to look at that, because we're also seeing that right around the May full moon, each year when we have the full moon in May, this is generally speaking the signification date for the birth and the moment of enlightenment of the Buddha. And it also suggests that the search for the meaning of life is a much more evolved quest for the sign of Taurus, because this is one of the key points. Everybody asks, I guess, what the meaning of life is. A lot of people, at some point, one way, even if you're not into that, at some place along the road, you're going to ask at one point, what does life mean? Well, that may be one question in a lifetime for most people. For a lifetime, this is the question of the sign of Taurus. Why am I here? What am I supposed to do? What am I supposed to do with my gifts and talents? Why was I given these gifts and talents? Is there anybody to recognize these gifts and talents? And so there's very definitely the question, it's a much more evolved quest for the sign of Taurus. And actually, once Taurus moves beyond the senses and the self-gratification and working past broken agreements, and they really start moving into the space of wanting to look at what the meaning of life is and what they can give back, what seeds they can plant, usually their life is quite smooth and quite even. Now we're going to talk about Taurus and how it experiences different portions of its life. And basically, when you look at a horoscope, it looks like 12 pie pieces that have been cut out of a whole pie. And these are called houses, and there's 12 of them. And each house represents a different area of life. And we always start out when we're doing one of these programs with the sign we're talking about. We're talking about the sign of Taurus right now. Now, generally speaking, the information that follows is more likely going to be qualifying someone who has Taurus rising. In other words, we have to find out what time of day a person is born to know that. But this will also apply to people who have a lot of Taurus in their horoscopes, or who have a very strongly placed Venus in their horoscope. So let's just move through this. The first house of the horoscope each time represents a lot of what we've been talking about: the identity and the physical appearance, the ego and the self-expression. And here's where we can put the sign of Taurus, which, generally speaking, we talked about the way a Taurus will oftentimes look, especially Taurus rising. They'll have usually very beautiful skin. They'll have more of a square build, a low forehead, a square jaw, a dimpled or cleft chin, and a kind of like an almond large kind of eye, much like a bovine kind of serene look. And generally speaking, when you look at them, they'll usually be very, very well dressed. They're not ones, even if they're dressed down, they'll generally look dressed up. They're not ones for having a whole lot of blue jeans in their closets or drawers. And they'll seem to be very quiet and reserved when you first meet them. And once you meet them and know them, they come out of that reserve. So basically, we've talked about a lot of those pieces. So now we move to the second house of the horoscope, which always shows a person's talents and how they handle their cash flow, their skills, and it shows their values. And we can put the sign of Gemini here, which would suggest one of the major talents that we see with the sign of Taurus is that they're basically pretty good communicators, or they can make money or have a lot of talent and skill in the world of communication, in the world of possibly advertising, marketing, selling, because Gemini, of course, was the winged messengers. He brought information all over the place to all the different people. And so people who have Gemini in the second house, Taurus risings especially, will make their money in the world of communications, possibly writing or speaking, as well as many times have two means of income, because Gemini is a dual sign. Make money doing one thing and make money doing something else. They may also notice that their money comes in as quickly as it goes out, because Gemini, and this is Taurus, Taurus usually makes very good money and they don't work for less than what they're worth, but as quickly as it comes in, it will go out. But they're always thinking about how to do this. They're always thinking about money too. That's one thing. Gemini is a thinking sign on the house of money, thinking about where to put this income, how to do this, reworking the cash flow sheets. It's a constant behavior when you know these people. It would also suggest that mentally they're quite active, and one of the ways they can also do very well in business or in making money is in problem solving and ideas, because Gemini is very definitely a problem solving sign of the zodiac. And one more important thing is that they may never quite grow up about their spending habits either, because Gemini in the second house is not exactly the most mature sign, but it would suggest that they're clever enough and shrewd enough that they can make it work. Now we go to the third house. The third house, generally speaking, is the house of how we communicate. It usually shows our brothers and sisters as well as relatives that are close to us, not mothers and fathers, but close relatives or close family members. And it also is how we process our learning, how we learn. And it's interesting, if we put the sign Cancer here, Cancer is a water sign, and it's a very feeling sign. Water is usually associated with feeling and emotions. And this is a group of people that are emotional communicators who, and this may sound negative. It's not meant to sound negative, but it is kind of funny. If a person has a lot of Taurus in the chart, generally speaking, if you try to get an answer out of them, they really are listening to you, but you may get a response like this, uh-huh, or or uh-huh. They don't really speak in words. They speak in feelings, and they'll be most comfortable if they're going to be communicating, or if you're asking them to give you an answer, if they're able to communicate from an emotional level rather than an intellectual level. They think about, the third house is what we think about a lot. They think about family a lot. They think about family obligations a lot. They may have brothers and sisters who are either mothers to them and fathers to them, or for whom they are mothers and fathers to their brothers and sisters. They may actually have brothers and sisters that are under the sign or born under the sign of Cancer. They think about food a lot, because Cancer is the sign of food and housing. And so they'll think about security, things like food and housing a lot. And as a result of that, they're usually very good at communicating about that to other people. So you will see them sometimes even in the food, restaurant, or real estate industry. We talked about that a little bit earlier. They also have a tendency to be the mother or father to their relatives. In other words, and to sometimes to their friends, where they're sort of a mother to everybody, the mother of the precursor of any mothers that are possible. In fact, if your friends didn't have good mother models, they'll always come to you if you have Taurus rising for you to be the mother model. And that's great, except after a while it starts to wear out and people start taking a lot more than they can give back. And this is one of the areas in terms of nurturing that Tauruses do have to learn to set limits on, because for some reason, if people really need their help, they'll be there to offer it, but they don't know how to cut it off or cut the faucet off. And this is an area where they can be emotionally drained if they're not careful. The other thing, too, if you're ever going to talk to a Taurus or Taurus rising, you always want to make sure that you feed them before you talk to them. Or if they're going to be doing a letter or writing a report, they'll always want to have food around them or food before they do it. This is a group, if they go out to lunch by themselves, which they don't like to do because they always like to be with people, but if they do, they'll always take papers with them while they're eating. They'll be reading. You've seen them in the restaurants where there's always a bunch of people just socializing and eating, and there's one or two in the restaurant reading their papers. That's probably a Taurus or a Taurus rising who doesn't, number one, want to waste any time, and number two, feels secure in studying something when they have food going through them. So if they haven't eaten, they're probably not going to be the most reasonable that they need to be. Now, if we go to the fourth house of the horoscope, the fourth house is always the place that shows where our family and our home came from, where we were born, how we were raised, our early roots, and all the family members that came before we were even born. And we can put the sign of Leo here, and it's really interesting. I had a teacher years ago that used to say, and a lot of the books say this too, that the fourth house of the horoscope always shows the beginning of life and the end of life, because it's the root that everything grows from. And it was so funny, she used to say that if you have Leo here, which we do in this case, we have Leo here, that first of all, there's probably royalty, because Leo is the sign of monarchs, kings, and queens. There's probably royalty somewhere along the family line, and that this individual may always appear as if they have a regal bearing. Number two, Leo is a sign that likes to have a lot of fun. So it would suggest that maybe in the early part of your life, there was a lot of love given to you and there was a lot of fun in the early home environment. And it would also suggest, as she used to say, if it's the end of life, that you'll probably have a party at your funeral. That the fourth house shows the kind of funeral we're going to have. If you have Virgo here, you may have a more reserved funeral. But Leo here in the fourth house, which suggests there's going to be a party, I'm always reminded of the funeral of John F. Kennedy in 1963, where Jacqueline Kennedy, who was a Leo, who still is a Leo, marched for miles alone, on the pavement in heels to her husband's burial site. And they had the cart and the horses, and it was a very regal, incredibly regal kind of funeral. And that reminds me of Leo on the fourth house. The mother might have been somebody, a very powerful role model, somewhat controlling, lots of fun, and someone who had a big heart. Sometimes we can put the father in this house, but generally speaking, it's the mother. It would suggest, since the fourth house is the kind of home you like to live in, Leo on the fourth would say that you would want your home to be a show place with lots of art and a place where people can come and have wonderful social functions. This is not going to be Taurus. A person who's a Taurus with Leo on the fourth house of home is not going to be comfortable with furnishings from the Salvation Army and furnishings that have lots of holes in them and worn out spots. Their home has to be a show place. Number one, it is their palace, and you do not go to their home unless you are invited. But once you're there, you're treated like a king or a queen. That's Leo on the fourth house. It would also suggest, too, that the family was basically full of love, and they had a lot of love to give, but they had a hard time receiving love. It might also suggest that the family, particularly the mother, might have had a very hard time setting limits with this child, saying when enough is enough. And it's pretty typical. Children who have a lot, or adults who have a lot of Taurus in their charts, they have this whole thing around desires and senses and getting what they want. They don't always know how to set limits with him, and many times that comes from early home life, people not setting limits with him. If we go over to the fifth house is always the house of children of the body as well as children of the mind. In other words, our birth children and our creativity, as well as it is the house that shows how we are in love and romance and what we require of lovers and what we love doing, because the fifth house has a lot to do with our hobbies and our avocations and what we love doing. And we can put the sign of Virgo here, which would suggest that the children that we birth may be a lot more practical than we are, because Virgo is a very practical sign, especially our firstborn. The second thing it might suggest is that our children have an incessant need to learn, because Virgo is a learning student sign, an ability to write, an ability to edit, ability to analyze, and also an ability to judge. It may suggest that with our children we may be judgmental and picky, because Virgo can be that, but that we may also serve our children selflessly. It would also suggest that if we do anything creative at all as a Taurus, that it not only has to be beautiful, wonderful, and it also has to be useful. So whatever their hobbies might be, for example, they may have a hobby of jewelry making, and it's a beautiful thing, but people can use it. They may be very good writers. It's one thing about people who have Taurus in the chart. Virgo is the sign of writers and people who work as proofreaders or editors or organizers or efficiency experts. This may be where they're very creative and most creative. Right use of space. Always bring a Taurus to your home if you want to know how to use the space correctly and beautifully, because they have a natural gift. It may suggest that with lovers, they may be very, very picky And either they're picky of their lovers or their lovers are picky of them. That they're very proper in relationships. Virgo is a very reserved and proper sign. And on the house of lovers, it would suggest that you're rather proper. You expect one-to-one. You expect that if you're involved with somebody, that they'll not be involved with anyone else. And that the person serves you and is kind towards you. And that they, too, in their own life, are rather practical and creative. They may also attract to them, since Virgo is a sign of service, lovers who serve them, but whose self-concept is not exactly what it should be. And it's very interesting. You know, Virgo is a wonderful sign, and it has a lot of wonderful gifts. But one of the areas that it does have to work on is its own self-worth and self-value. So in love relationships, you, as a Taurus, may not always have a lot of value for yourself and may attract to you people that are not up to your par. Or you may attract to you lovers that are the same. They don't have a high self-concept in themselves and that need to work on that. When we move into the 6th house, this is the house of work and service, and also how we deal with and handle our health, and how we work with other people in a working environment, and how we serve. Now, the sign of Libra goes here, which is interesting because Libra, like Taurus, is ruled by Venus, so it likes pleasure and it likes people getting along. So it would suggest that in a work situation, you are easy to get along with, and that people do love working with you, and that you are very fair. Libra is a sign of fairness, that you would be fair to employees, and you expect the same from them. That you would judge things properly and try to treat everyone equally, that you yourself, if you're a boss and you're a Taurus with an employee, would actually put them on an equal level with yourself, which is, there's some good things around that, but it doesn't always help sometimes, because sometimes there's going to have to be someone who makes the decisions, and it may be very difficult for a person who has Taurus to make decisions as to how things should be run in the work environment. It would also suggest that in terms of health, we talked about how Venus rules the throat chakra, and a Taurus really has to watch their throat. Well, Libra, the sign of Libra, rules the low back and the kidneys. And this is another area, if there is stress, that might have some problems, because if there's stress, the system will probably hold toxics or water a lot longer, and not be able to flush them through kidneys. So one of the things, there's sometimes a problem with the kidneys being too small. And this is an area, especially if there's colds, that may constantly be susceptible to disease, especially if your head is not in the right place. So the one thing you got to watch when you have Libra on the 6th house is watching eating rich foods. There is, Libra, again, like Taurus, is associated with chocolates and sweets, and this is the house of diet. So you may have a real sweet tooth being a Taurus, or a real, if it's not a sweet tooth, it's a desire for a lot of carbohydrates and bread, which actually is an energy food, but if you do too much of that, then it can hurt your system and affect it. The other thing, too, is dieting. You know, this is the house that shows dieting. This is Libra here would say you gain weight, you lose weight. You go on diets, you get off of them. It's very difficult to make a decision about diets with this sign. The only time they really make decisions with diets and when they really feel personally that they're not looking as good as they should. It has nothing to do with whether they're healthy or not. It's how they look. And once they decide they don't look well enough or well enough in their clothing, then they go on a diet. It's not because the doctor says, well, you know, you should stop smoking because it's going to kill you. It's all totally superficial and surface.
I hope you're enjoying the Myths and the Signs of the Zodiac series. I know I love doing it, and I hope you're enjoying them as well. If you want to learn more about astrology or just find out about what we do, please go to our foundation, which is the Alexandria ibase.org Foundation, which is a free database that's available to people all over the planet. If you're interested in astrological books or articles, all you have to do is put the subject in the keyword phrase and it will find it for you. We have a lot of old Mercury hours and a lot of old journals uploaded. It's a great, juicy place to find astrological literature, where it's located. So I hope to see you there, and I hope you continue enjoying my series. Thank you.
If we go to the 7th house, we see the house of marriage and legal partnerships here. And this is also the house of not only marriage, but intimate, long-term committed relationships. And it shows the kinds of partners we attract to us and sometimes how we project to other people that we are. We can put the intense, obsessive, compulsive sign of Scorpio here, which would suggest, since Scorpio is the most compulsive sign of the zodiac, that in terms of our intimate, long-term relationships, we are compulsive and addicted to them. That once we make a decision to a commitment, regardless of what happens, it's a very hard commitment to break. It would suggest that we do not want weak partners, that we want partners that are very much in touch with their own power and who we, in fact, will always try to control, who will not let us control them. And in fact, with Scorpio in this house, it would suggest that if the partner is weak, you're not, as a Taurus, going to be interested, because Taurus, much like its opposite sign Scorpio, eats you up alive if you show any kind of weakness. So they'll always attract to them a partner that is either powerful or a partner that tries to control them back. And there'll be this power dance that they're constantly doing between them in their long-term business relationships or personal relationships that is very much like the relationship in the mythologies of Zeus and his wife Hera. That, that's an interesting story, because if you read all the stories about Zeus and Hera, she was always yelling and screaming and angry at him, and she has actually a lot of very bad press. But if you really go on and look at the stories, this was his only wife, his only legal wife. And at the end of, I believe, the Iliad, actually a friend told me this, at the end of the Iliad, after the Odyssey and all of it's over, you have a beautiful poem from Zeus to Hera talking about how he truly loved her, that she was always his first wife, and that he always loved her and he always respected her, and she was really the only one in the end for him. It's just a beautiful romantic poem. And so this is what happens in Taurus's long-term love relationships. They're long-term, committed, passionate relationships that are not easy, because Scorpio in the 7th house does not suggest easy relationships, but it does suggest that intimate long-term relationships are the vehicle through which we transform our lives. And for that reason, we can also attract to us quite powerful people and transform other people's life in a very powerful way. If we move to the 8th house, we have the sign of Sagittarius here, which is always the house. It's another one of those financial houses, but it's also the house that deals with the real intimate, vital energies of life: death, birth, and regeneration and transformation. It's the house that shows how we make our money by working with resources of other people, thereby gaining our own. It would suggest that, since Sagittarius is quite lucky, and that this is also the house of legacies and inheritances and insurance settlements and settlements from any kind of legal lawsuits, that there would be an ability here to be a beneficiary on many levels. Beneficiary for unknown insurance policies, that family would, generally speaking, give you something at their death, leave you something at their death, which you can work with and work with your vision on. It would suggest that one of the areas that you might do very well in terms of investing may be in the arena of education or educational tools, because Sagittarius is the sign of education. It's also the sign of travel and foreign countries and import-export. So these are some of the areas that would be good investment opportunities for people, particularly of Taurus rising. It would also suggest that they're rather free-spirited and they have a rather open attitude and a rather positive attitude about death. This is not a sign of the zodiac that dwells on the negativity of death. Actually, they look at the positive end of death and birth. There's a real positive attitude. This is a very free thinking. Sagittarius, this is also the house of sexuality and how we view sexuality. And so with Sagittarius here, which is a rather free sign, Taurus or Taurus rising is fairly free and fairly open about their sexuality, and there's not a whole lot of secrets that they keep. If there was another sign on this house of the zodiac, for example, Scorpio here, there would be a lot more secrets and a lot more things not said or explained. But Sagittarius on the 8th house, they're very open and, generally speaking, are very able to get past negative things that they may have experienced in early childhood. If we go to the 9th house, the 9th house is always the house of our philosophy, our belief systems, our higher education, and the road we took for that. And we can put the sign of Capricorn here, which is another earth sign, which is very conservative. It would suggest that the basic philosophy of Taurus is a conservative philosophy, that in order to change their beliefs or to change how they think about things, you better give them some pretty good material in order to have them change. It would suggest that they equate education with status, that this is a group that will go for the PhDs because there's something about the credential that gives them status in the outer world, and Capricorn is very definitely a status-oriented sign. It would suggest that they would be able to teach people or consult with people about business and efficiency in business, because Capricorn rules business and efficiency in business. And it's also the sign that rules real estate. So they might be very good in, again, selling real estate or teaching about real estate. It would suggest that they may attend classes and study well into life, that this is a sign that really never gives up on education, and that, in fact, may have gone to school to learn one thing, and somehow their education might have been interrupted, or they changed their view along the road, and then later in life they really go back and get the education for the career that came to them rather than them finding it, which takes us to the next house. The 10th house is always the house that shows ultimately where we are going with our life, ultimately our career and our public standing. It also suggests how we saw our father. Generally speaking, it's the father, sometimes it's the mother. We can put the sign of Aquarius here, which is rather magical and innovative and inventive, which does suggest that Tauruses, regardless of how organized and fixed they are in terms of pursuing their goals, that many times the career they end up being in is something that's of their own invention, or the work found them, they didn't find the work as a result of all the different interests they had. Since Aquarius is an air sign and does rule public information, one of the strongest industries that this personality can be in is in the industry of public information. Advertising, marketing, astrology, computers, radio, TV, electronics, these are all the airlines. In fact, I recently spoke with a client whose father, and she has Aquarius in the midheaven on the 10th house, whose father was an Air Force historian. And so it's very interesting that at some point in the life, and usually it's between around the 42nd and 49th year of life, that this kind of industry would begin to show its face to you, and that your industry would be the result of a lot of different experiences that you bring together in your own innovative, eclectic mode. Now, as far as father and how you saw your father, it might suggest that there was a tremendous amount of closeness to the father at one point, and then suddenly there was sudden separation or volatile experiences you had of the father. You might have had a father that you saw as rather unpredictable, volatile, sometimes available and sometimes very much not available. In other words, a person that wasn't always there for you, only when it was convenient for them. It may also suggest that your father was rather an innovative, unconventional personality, because Aquarius is definitely an innovative, unconventional personality, and that's how you saw him, is that he went in his own lane. He didn't follow the crowd with other people. Aquarius, one of my teachers used to say, is the sign of the big dealers, and it is possible that if you have, especially Taurus rising, that your experience of your father was that he was, and perhaps it might have been the mother if she's taken on that role, a big dealer, a person who dealt very much in business in a very large way, who hit a large market at the most appropriate time in history. Now we move to the 11th house. The 11th house is the house of our goals, our friends, and how we view our goals and how we achieve our goals. And we can put the sign of Pisces here. It would suggest that since Pisces is the sign of sorrows, that we do sometimes experience sorrow through our friends. That's the negative side. But Pisces is also the musician and the artist and the painter of the zodiac, and we may have extremely creative friends also who are healers, or for whom we hold the role of healer, because Pisces is the sign of healing. And that our friends may come to us as sort of a sounding board to help them process through their negative feelings, which again is very much in line with which was said a little bit earlier in terms of how we nurture our relatives and our close friends. One of the problems here may be you give too much and you don't know how to set the limits. But the other side may be, too, that your friends may be actually the vehicle that you bounce things off of to move your own negative feelings through into more positive. It would suggest that your goals have to have some type of spiritual satisfaction attached to them. It can't be a situation where, gee, this is a great thing to do with my life because I'm going to make a lot of money and be successful. There has to be a creative spiritual connection. And this is one of the reasons Tauruses, even though they do very well usually in business, it's something that they really have their heart and soul in, that their goals have to involve the soul. And sometimes they actually work with people's souls or helping people find their souls. We move to the last house of the horoscope, which is the 12th house, which I always call the blind spot of the chart because it's the part that happens right before we're born. So we don't always see everything. But it's also where we keep a lot of our spiritual treasure. And it's also, as some people say, the place that shows our past life experiences, if you believe in that sort of thing. And And we can put the beginning of the zodiac Aries here, which says that there may be a past life memory of being a warrior and a trailblazer and having had a lot of wounding. And that's one of the reasons as a Taurus, it may sometimes feel like there's this compulsion to be passive because the experience was that there was a lot of wounding because you acted before you thought. It also suggests that in terms of your personal life, your spiritual life, your private fantasy life, that you need time because there's a lot of innovation that comes through in your life through that private time. It would suggest that you may be a pioneer in the world of spiritual pursuits because Aries is the sign of pioneering and it is in the house of spiritual pursuits. It may suggest, as far as a blind spot goes, that we talked about temper earlier. We said Taurus goes for a long time. It doesn't say anything, then it explodes. But we talked about how Aries explodes as soon as it's irritated. Well, one of the lessons you may have here is that when something is bothering you, if you look at the house before birth, the 12th house, is to respond immediately rather than holding it in. And that way you keep your head clear. And in fact, if you're not responding, sometimes there may be problems here with headaches because Aries rules the head and the head region. One more thought with Aries on the 12th house is that there is a quality here of this personality who's a Taurus of spiritual adventure. There's an ability here to travel where no man goes before, as they used to say in the old Star Trek versions, that there's a tremendously strong vitality. They don't usually get diseases or catch anything from anyone. This is a very healthy sign of the zodiac Taurus. It can live to be quite old as Capricorn does, and it's because there's always this adventure of spirit and fantasy and creativity that always stays alive in them from the moment they're born to the moment they die. And then we begin again at the beginning with the sign of Taurus. So in conclusion, Taurus is the sign out of all the signs of the zodiac that is about values, valuing oneself and valuing others. And they learn about values for themselves and others by going through the experience of working on agreements, not breaking them, learning how to overcome their deep desires, in other words, to balance desire with logic. And that's one of the gifts they bring into this world, is to teach people not only about values, but how to tap into resources and use what they have in a very creative and imaginative way. And as a result of that, make it not only wonderful to live with, but beautiful and aesthetic.
Hello, this is Georgia Stathis. You've been listening to our archived series, Myths and Signs of the Zodiac, and we thank you. If you liked what you heard and you'd like to know more and hear more, please go to our website at starcycles.com, where you can find an assortment of available tools, pieces of information, and things that you can use in your own practice or in your own study of astrology. Again, thank you so much, and we hope to see you soon.